The rumors of a remake of Silent Hill 2 have been floating in the air for years, both fanfare and incredible nervousness from die-hard fans of one of the most beloved horror games of all time. I understand the fears. It is an incredibly nuanced story, and much of the way the story is presented is dated to the time it was released. It's not an easy game to update to modern markets when so much of how it is told is tied into the era it was born in. Now the remake of Silent Hill 2 is confirmed, as is the team making the game. Two original members of the development team, Ito Masahiro and Yamaoka Akira, have returned to the title. But it is also being developed by Bloober Team, a development studio with a rocky reputation and in particular, a history of writing horror games about mental illness to mixed effect. Fans were not pleased with the announcement, and I understand the feeling, but I have a different impression. My thoughts about a Silent Hill 2 remake will likely run counter to most. There are other creators in the field who I deeply respect that feel strongly Bloober Team should not be allowed anywhere near this project. I disagree, and I'm hopeful this may pan out to be a wonderful game, and I am glad that it exists, even as others argue that only the original game is necessary. A day after the Silent Hill announcements, my teenage niece called me excitedly. "That series you love, Silent Hill, is coming back," she told me. Of course, I knew, but she was excited to talk about it because it was in the news, big YouTubers were discussing it, and it felt cool and new to her. She's never played the series with me, because she says it looks old and bad, and, well, from her point of view, she's hardly wrong. However, she was excited about the idea of playing these new, updated Silent Hill games with me. And that is who a Silent Hill 2 remake is for, after all. A culture that has evolved past the original and developed a new context for media. It is the tragic yet natural march of time that devastates us all, and in gaming it's particularly harsh, because the technology involved improves so incredibly fast, and the medium as a whole, compared to other fields, is still very young, and it's still evolving its own sense of history, its genres, and its traditions. The truth is, culture evolves fast, and what was once a masterpiece that influenced generations is eventually forgotten. Consider the world of written fiction. Some of my favorite novels are Gothic literature written hundreds of years ago, most of which will never be read by the modern person. They'll be researched by professionals and discussed in higher literature classes, and some folks will read them from time to time, fans of horror and historical novels. But they will never have the societal impact they once had unless something is done to modernize them. One of my favorite novels, The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, was a phenomenon when it was first released. It criticized the British Empire and racism, it presented a fascinating mystery, and it was hugely popular, influential, and controversial in its time. But I imagine very few people watching this video have heard of it, and even fewer have read it. The Gothic novels that still matter, Frankenstein and Dracula, are more commonly known, but I imagine most don't read them. They know the works through modern means, adaptations, movies, comics, or new retellings of old tales. It's the nature of media. One day, your favorite story will no longer be relevant, and if the creator of said story wants it to be, they will have to translate it into a modern and accessible form. For a video game, it is graphics and gameplay which are the highest bars to accessibility. My niece grew up on modern games on the PS4. To her, these games look ridiculous. The tank controls and fixed cameras would not make sense to her. And it's not that no one could in fact adjust to these things. You could access and learn to play older games in their own way. But it will never be societally widespread the way something modern will. A modernized Silent Hill 2 will bring the incredible narrative of the original game to a widespread modern audience. It will be heavily streamed and discussed by mainstream media and new YouTubers, and a new generation will find and experience the game. This will be my niece's Silent Hill 2. And the alternative is she simply never would have experienced it. Not because she could not, but because she would choose not to. The original is simply not to her taste. That is at the heart of many people's anger and disappointment. The fact that it's hard to accept that what you value highly is no longer relevant or modern. What was formerly the most famous horror game has been overshadowed, and the average gamer, 20 years old or younger, knows Resident Evil and Five Nights at Freddy's better than they do Silent Hill. It is simply how time works. That's not to say I think this remake should be the only accessible version of the game. I am of the opinion that Konami is testing the waters with this title. They're throwing the biggest pitch possible after years of silence, controversy, and failures before attempting to port the game that might bring back memories of past mistakes. Konami would not come out after years of nothing to once again release Silent Hill 2, especially because such a re-release would be far more relevant and likely to succeed after making the game relevant to all audiences with a remake. The fact that Ito and Yamaoka have returned is a sign that good things are to come. The central team behind Silent Hill 2 included Ito Masahiro, Sato Takayoshi, Imamura Akihiro, the translator Jeremy Blostein, and scenario writer Owaku Hiroyuki. Yamaoka was not as heavily involved in the story development from what I've read. He worked in a separate building, but it seems likely he was at least tangentially involved. But Ito Masahiro was central to the story from the beginning, and had been central to Silent Hill as a series for some time. He was personally taught by the first game's director, Toyama Keiichiro, a man who he still has a good relationship with. It was his first game project, and he learned the development ropes during the game. Silent Hill 2 was his second, and he was incredibly involved in it. He designed the concepts for every monster, assisted in their modeling, and animated every motion of their movement, created every cutscene involving the monsters, as well as designing portions of the town itself, including central locations important to scenes with said monsters. While there are others who I wish could have been involved with remakes, it's likely that Ito and Yamaoka, as freelancers living in Japan, were the easiest to reconnect with, while others have either moved on to other companies or become heavily involved in other departments of Konami's business. Ito Masahiro is very particular about his creations. He designed Pyramid Head from top to bottom, from his movement to his lore, and he's careful about how the creature is portrayed. Even when designing Pyramid Head for other projects, he's careful to specify figures like the White Hunter are not James's Pyramid Head. And in the past, he was very particular about how and when he would return to Silent Hill, such as a cancelled 2013 project in which Konami brought him onto a Silent Hill game in which he planned to kill Pyramid Head. Being well established as a freelance artist, I cannot imagine Ito would return to the series unless he was guaranteed a level of control and influence that certified he would be confident in the final project, and that he would have a lot of say in what it looked like, how the story was presented, and in particular, how his famous monster was used and designed. What we've seen so far reflects that. The trailer showed scenes that were almost all incredibly recognizable, if slightly different and modern. Scenes that immediately place the moment in a particular part of town and a particular part of the game. Pyramid Head appears in a short moment at the end of the trailer and resembles his original self, not the more modern or buff versions that exist later. While many have said his movement looks off, and I agree, I have a feeling this was a rushed add-on to the trailer to ensure fans could see his appearance, and not what he'll actually move like in-game. After all, this particular scene doesn't look like a moment in the game, and Ito was the movement designer for Pyramid Head. He has a very specific idea of what that movement looks like, and I doubt he'll let us down. The other moment that was different was this one, a scene that did not exist in the original to my knowledge, in which James appears to pick up what may be a bloody handkerchief. It's obviously tied into Mary and her disease, and it may imply that they are going to go more in depth into what her illness was and what she suffered, which is an addition I would approve of. Otherwise, it looks very much like the team has kept true to the original game and its plot, merely improving the graphics to a modern standard. There are two changes we will all have to likely accept. First, the combat of the original game was never what I would call fun. It wasn't the point, so it never bothered me, but I am not against a modernization of said combat into something that might be more appealing. In addition, there were ideas related to the combat that the original team had to cut. They were going to have cinematic interactions in combat where the player could interact with Pyramid's helmet and somehow damage him, which just couldn't happen. There was also a concept where Pyramid Head would actually act as a hunter that actively followed you, like a Mr. X or a Nemesis, which you can see in some of the early game trailers. It was also not to be, but a modern game might add these cut concepts back in. The other change is James. He looks different, there's no arguing it, but there's really no changing it either. The original James was modeled and mocapped after Guy Sihi, a man who has burned many bridges with Konami. Suffice to say, he no longer works with the company. It's very likely this is the reason James doesn't resemble his original form. I understand some fans missing the original look, but this is a case of there simply being no other option. They probably can't use the original look. Personally, I'm a little concerned about the puzzles of the game. It's a somewhat outdated concept, and while mainstream games like Resident Evil have included puzzles, they were more like finding and moving objects than they were occult, esoteric riddles. I worry they might not be included, but I can't possibly imagine the game without them. It would be nice if they remained in some form or another, and even better if the devs added a new difficulty for fans who've played the game to death and memorized the answers. Most of all, I know people are worried about Bloober Team. I have to preface this by saying my own experience with the team has been fine, because I've only played a single game, Blair Witch. I honestly had a lot of fun with it. The story was forgettable and barely impactful, which is certainly a sign of what others have been saying, that writing is not their strong suit. But visually, the game was beautiful, and the final portion of the game in the house was so phenomenal. It might have been my new favorite horror game if more of the experience had been like that portion. It is haunting, unpredictable, and incredibly creepy, and it honestly made me think this might be what a modern otherworld of Silent Hill would look like. But there are others who are worried about the team because of their poor experience with writing, in particular with mental illness. The most recent title they've released, The Medium, left many divided. I've heard of fans who love it and many who hate it, in large part to how it portrayed mental illness and the message it seemed to provide. I have mixed feelings. Obviously, everyone's personal experience with art is valid, and for many this game did not work. Why? Well, horror that portrays marginalized experiences is always walking a fine line. Works like Hannibal remain divisive between those who disapprove of the presentation of queerness that is violent and amoral, while others enjoy the work for what it is, an incredible horror story centered on a dangerous, destructive romance. Mental illness in horror is especially difficult because of years of tropes that use mental illness itself as the fear at the heart of the story, in which being ill or in an asylum or hospital is itself the worst thing imaginable. It is hard to balance trying to tell a story which frightens and horrifies, without also some way implying negative conditions to the people involved. Consider Silent Hill 2. The water ending presents us with a narrative in which a survivor of abuse and rape who is clearly ill believes she deserved her treatment and ultimately kills herself, and in water shows James agreeing with her essentially, killing himself as well, reinforcing the narrative. There's no happy ending for ill people. Is that a bad narrative? Is that implying something negative for the mentally ill? Maybe, if that's how it struck you. But I've rarely heard that argued, and it comes down to how well the narrative is presented, how much sympathy and tragedy is woven into the characters, and Angela in particular. For Bloober Team, it seems likely the narratives they've written simply haven't managed that nuance and development, and so have struck at least part of their audience as offensive and poorly written. They haven't managed the careful balance Silent Hill has, and in that case, isn't remaking Silent Hill 2 the best possible thing for them? If it is as it appears, that they are carefully recreating the exact experience and possibly adding content only in the sense of deepening what was already there, including content that was cut from the original title, then Bloober Team is walking in the steps of greatness. Like an artist who first traces a design to get a feel for how to create it, Silent Hill 2 has the potential to teach a team with a lot of graphical and technological talent how to write a careful and respectful horror narrative, to help fill in the gaps and weaknesses in their own content. It's not guaranteed they will, and there's every chance fans' worst fears will be realized. From what we've seen so far, however, I don't think it's foolish to hope the opposite will be true. It will come down to how much the team sticks to the concepts of the original, how closely Ito and Yamaoka are allowed to oversee and influence the team, and in part, how much the modern audience will be open to the narrative. After all, Silent Hill 2 was considered less than stellar when it was first launched. Who knows how it will be seen the second time around. I hope, this will become a new fantastic game that presents another glimpse into this haunted town and this particular terrifying narrative, that will allow for fascinating conversations and comparisons with the original, that will draw new fans to the stories old and new, and encourage Konami to re-release the originals to a new generation. There's still much that could happen and a long time to wait, but I am content to wait in hope for Silent Hill 2.